Hey, welcome back to Third Party Threat Hunters podcast. This week, I've got Jerry Chapman, who I've known for some time now. I don't remember actually when we first kind of ran into each other and I actually trying to shake my head now. And when did we run into each other? And it's probably at one of these speaking events that we overlap on sometimes. But
Absolutely.
more importantly, Jerry's as a technical editor on my latest book, Zero Trust and Third Party Risk, and I chose Jerry not just because he's got one of the best haircuts in the field as well, uh, but just that because he's also written his own Zero Trust book, co-authored his own Zero Trust book, and I still am, always consider myself a Zero Trust neophyte. So I wanted to make sure I had somebody to keep me in the guardrails and help me learn and keep me honest as I wrote the book. So Jerry, you want to just kind of give a bit of background to the listeners and
Yeah,
about you?
real quick. So I've been in industry for about 30 years, but I've been doing this identity cybersecurity for the last 20 plus years, right? The last 7 years really is where I started focusing on zero trust, which has really been very interesting to me because I found that I moved from just thinking about identity as this identity thing to a central part of security and cybersecurity. And doing so really allowed me to start thinking about, well, what does this really mean? And that's where the zero trust stuff came from. And to be perfectly honest, it's a fun place to be. I enjoy what I'm doing, and I've been doing this for about 7 years. And thank you, Greg, for having me on this podcast. I'm looking
Oh,
forward to the conversation.
I follow Chris Romeo's advice, and he set up a podcast. And the reason he said he set up is he could meet cool, smart people and have a conversation with them. And so that's really what these are about. Is a little selfishly for me to kind of pick somebody else's smarter brain and figure out how they're thinking about problem space in the cyber and third party risk space and zero trust in your case. So. What's bugging you recently about anything in the cyberspace, or what's been kind of your chief keeping you awake at night?
What keeps me awake at night? um,
Yeah, right.
I mean, I think that's almost loaded, right? I'm not a
Yeah,
CISO,
it
so I'm
is a
not
bit.
worried.
It is a bit loaded.
It is. I mean, I'm not a CISO, so I'm not directly responsible for an organization's entire security or
Yeah,
program. So
yeah.
that's not keeping me awake, certainly. But I'll tell you that one of the things that recently that I'm talking a lot about, spending some time on, is NIST and the NIST 800-207 documentation, right? So they came out obviously in August 2021, right after our book, mine and Jason's book, Enterprise Guide, Zero Trust and Enterprise Guide. They came out with their final version of the NIST 800-207, and inside of
Okay.
that, right, they had they had an architecture, right, a theoretical architecture where you had a lot of signals feeding into what they called their policy decision point. Um, and those signals really was referenced through what they called the control plane, right? So
Uh-huh.
you had this control plane which was taking all the signals to help drive policy, and this is all
Oh, okay.
theoretical, and that's really what what's going on there. And so that was interesting, right? In August 2021, literally in the last 2 days, I believe they released their final draft of their 800-207 207A documentation, um,
Yeah.
which is
This
interesting.
numbering is always yeah. Yeah. Keep going.
It's always fun, right? So them releasing that, and what they've done is they've taken that control plane. So it's really around cloud native applications and what does zero trust look like with cloud native applications. But what they came out with was this more defined control plane. So now you have these risk signals and all these things in the control plane. There's a more defined control plane now where they have this management plane, where now you have tools and user interface and things that are managing the elements of that control plane to drive those signals and support those signals, as well
Mhm.
as what they're calling the global control plane, right? So if I'm in a cloud native environment, you got the big control plane, and then ultimately localized control planes.
Mhm.
Um, so this is really
Right.
interesting to me what they've done with that to really drive that down.
Let me see if I can help with the viewers or listeners in
Yeah.
how this may translate into their space. So, in a third-party risk space, in particular, we're a software-driven society, right? So when you talk about the cloud, and I talk to fellow practitioners, we really focus in on cloud-supplied software, right? And in our space, I'd say, I don't know what the number is. It's 70% of the stuff that comes across my desk to review, or my team's desk, is SaaS-provided software, right? So how does that control plane help us better secure that stuff in the cloud? And just help our listeners with that one.
Yeah, so having the different, what I would say, control planes, or different elements to drive it, the global control plane or the localized control plane. What that does is now it gives the applications the capability to receive and manage those signals without having to jump across the globe to figure out what's going on. So if you've got a, if you've got a pop
So
somewhere, and sorry, go
a
ahead.
context driven. Sorry, just to make sure it's so. If I can just so I can understand it better too.
Please.
It's a context. It's the context engine that's making decisions about whether users can access it, resources can access to this type of hardware. Okay, good. Keep going.
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. Think of the policy, right? The policy is
Right.
all about who can access what and when and under what conditions, right? So that's really what these control planes are starting to drive is globally. How do you do it across the cloud platform, and then locally closer to the user? So if I'm at a pop somewhere in Europe, that I'm accessing the application out of Europe, then guess what? Now I've got this control plane or these signals and context is driving the access locally there. And same is true if I'm in Asia or in North America. There's you now have the capability through these localized control planes to feed up into ultimately a global control plane to be managed across this. It's really fascinating. And listen, I'm hitting it very, very high level, but
No, it's great. It's great, and I think this is a great discussion because then it can expand on kind of why we thought the zero trust and third party risk book was important, and what does it help explain, right? So the premise that I started the book out with was that a third party incident is mathematically inevitable.
Yep.
I might have people who might argue that with me a little bit, but the fact that everybody's somebody else's vendor and the fact that we have so much cyber activity, I think supports that thesis. Then we say, okay, if that's the case, then it's not a question of if, but a question of when your third party breach will happen. And then the question then becomes, how do I reduce the impact of that breach? And that's why I thought of zero trust and started going down that path. On the context piece, I like the context piece because it takes just the standard sort of identity access management piece out of it of, yes, Jerry gets admin access to those services 24/7 and says, no, Jerry only needs this level of access, read access only, let's say, and he should only be accessing it from the US through business hours. I mean, that's the level of context you can get. And I think that is a much better place to be in than just turning the switch on and saying, Jerry, have at it. Access the resource as much as you want, whenever you want. Right.
I'll take that that example you just used and drive it a little deeper, right? Which I love to have that conversation because it's I can do it from my home network, but I'm not going to be able to do it from the Starbucks across the street, right? So it's going a little bit deeper in that. So now I'm in the Starbucks across the street, and hey, my device is not not recognizing the network. It's a new network. It's all these different things. Boom. You don't get to have access because you're not somewhere where I know you have to be, and you're not in the same context. I love that part of the conversation.
And it can even check the status of your own device and see is it meet the standards that would expect, and if not,
Right.
either quarantine it or boot it off, right?
That's
And
right.
say come
That's
back
right.
when you're ready. Some of this was solved by 802.1x, and I talked about that a bit in the book, and you guys corrected me and said, look, 802.1x has some issues. And I'll be honest, and not that I would be dishonest, but transparent is probably the better way to say it. Is that come from a place of safety? When I was at Cisco years ago, I deployed ICE 0.9 version and up, and so I'm very familiar with the NAC products. First of all, help the viewers or you listeners with what's the issue with 802.1x and what should we be looking at in difference to that, this software defined perimeter and other things that are just better at it, I think is probably a better way to describe it.
So I think 802.x, 802.1.x, it's had its place. It was actually it was a place that um, that we could effectively do some of the stuff we're talking about with zero trust today, right? The device management, understanding. Listen, that had its time in the sun, and it was fantastic for what it did, right? And yes, there were vulnerabilities, there were issues with it, and so that certainly is a place where we were. But the problem now is you take that, some of the NAC controls that you have in place, and I'll be honest with you, Greg, I am not a NAC expert, right? My background is not specifically for that. I'm not an expert, but I do know some of those vulnerabilities that are there. But if you
Yeah.
start to move away from that and you start thinking about the SDP, or software defined perimeter protocols, and single packet authentication, and actually I recently was talking with a vendor that's not even, they're even doing authentication before the SPA authentication. So before the network layer single packet authentication, they're even
Wow.
doing authentication before that, which is really an interesting concept,
Yeah, it is.
right?
Yeah.
So now it's shifting from, hey, we've got to manage all these policies in the air and try to manage that, to this, let's define the policy at the endpoints. That's certainly a place where we want to do it. If you talk to, I don't want to drop names here, but if you talk to John Kindervag, right, he's going to tell you, listen, you've got to protect the asset at the asset and figure that out, and everything from there goes out, which is fine. Which I
Yeah.
think is, absolutely you have to do. But that endpoint, or those wireless devices, or those devices that are coming in, are critical to understand what they
Yeah.
are, so you can protect that asset, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it's interesting because and it's just that when you brought that up in your book, um, Jason and I. So when Jason and I wrote our book, we had that very conversation around the neck.
Yeah.
um,
Good.
and we're like, we just, the NAC has to go away. To be honest with you, VPN needs to go away. Um,
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
those were things that we talked about. In fact, even in our book, we mentioned, hey, you should consider replacing your VPN. But I've been talking for years about that, and one of the things I've said is, organizations have spent millions of dollars on these VPNs that you can't ask them to go throw it out, right? So
Well,
you
and
have to.
it
Sorry, go ahead.
sorry, no, no. I just wanted to add to that. By the way, there are companies that are still in the process of implementing 802.1x.
Oh,
I
there
mean, so
are.
it's not.
Yeah.
That's why I'm kind of laughing a little bit. Is 802.1x had its day in the sun, and yet folks are still trying to shine through it.
Well,
So
and
it's
I've
to play
talked to
the analogy a
people.
little bit.
Well,
Yeah,
I've
go ahead.
talked to people that are still saying that, hey, let's 802.802.1.x is how I'm going to implement zero trust, and I'm like, oh my god, sorry, oh
Then
my
you've got a
god, what
problem.
do you,
Houston, you have a problem.
Houston, we have a problem. Let's talk
Yeah,
about
yeah,
this. Let's just define this,
yeah, yeah.
because there is
How?
much better ways to do it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, and again, it's like much of like third party risk. It's not a tool or technology. It's a program and a process. It's a strategy, as I got rightly corrected by John and others
That's right.
several times, and it's a strategy that I'll give George Finney his credit too, right? I sat in on the IC Square Congress last year as I was presenting, and I sat in on George's presentation on his Zero Trust Journey book. I'm going to mispronounce the title. Hopefully, George doesn't get too mad at me. But he'd broken it down into sort of an OSI table, and that sort of was for me I got it. Okay, I can figure out how to now mash the two together. Um, and then I'm looking for, okay, so I've got the mash the two together. Now I got to figure out somebody who can help me with the zero trust piece. And I started reading your book already, and so I rushed to finish it. And then said, "Oh, maybe Jerry will be my technical editor." And he said, "Yes, cool, all right, great." So now I got the book, right. So as I laid out the book, what I would really appreciated was that your ability to just call it out like it was, right? Hey, Greg, you might want to think about doing this a little differently, or it was great feedback. And again, for those who haven't written a book, and that's a lot of people, unfortunately, the process is pretty interesting. I think it's probably the best way to describe it, right? So you do a draft and all that, and you have to pitch it and stuff like that, and you got to find a technical editor, and so there aren't a lot of zero trust. There's a lot of zero trust books. There's not a lot of zero. I would say I'm going to be careful. There's a lot of zero trust books. Let me just leave it at that. So you got to figure out how do you find out the one that the editor and something like that. And so I was really happy that you were going to do that, Jerry, and we done it. By the way, the book comes out here fairly shortly. It's a couple of weeks. By the end of September, it should be out. So
I'm excited. I mean,
fingers crossed.
the third party risk stuff behind zero trust. I'm going to expand on something I think you started this conversation with. Like, vendors are just a natural part of what we're using. If you think about most organizations, they're either using some sort of CRM, or they're using
Yep.
some system in the cloud that's managing everything they do, and
Correct.
and to be that is a third party, right?
Yeah.
And they are, in a lot of cases, a huge target just because of the wealth of data that they have.
Well, you saw the APTs, the advanced persistent actors. They now know not to go after the primary target. They go after the third party and get into a side door. SolarWinds was not the target.
That's right.
The target was the three-letter agencies. They just used SolarWinds to get into it. Keep going. You had a thought there you wanted to finish.
Yeah. So it's just, the whole third party side of this, and for organizations to understand and have to start thinking through, well, how do I ensure that from a third party that I have the same quote unquote zero trust controls in place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or security
Yep.
controls in place that I want to implement for my organization.
Right.
And I'll be honest, I loved your book. I loved the thought of the book, and that's why I was really happy to be the technical editor on it. Because I think, to your point, that is 100% something that we have to spend some time on. We have to think through.
Well, companies should and do use vendors for the right reasons. We don't want to solve all the problems on our own.
Right.
A bank does not want to create HR software, so it's going to go out and find a company that makes software for it. We all know who these are,
Right.
and the list goes on, right? So they're valuable partners, and yet we've spent billions of dollars as organizations to secure our first party, meaning putting a bigger moat, and bigger walls and putting more guards inside the castle and all that stuff, right? And yet we left the side door open for the staff to come in, the help to come in the side door without doing any kind of checks on them. And that's the result is what we've got. I think the other concern I have in this space is just the amount of software vulnerabilities and the zero-day vulnerabilities that continue ad infinitum. I mean, MoveIt's the latest one, but I could list a half dozen others that have been in the last year. That Acelion, file transfer application, Hafnium, SolarWinds, of course, MoveIt. There's again, I'm going to forget the other half dozens that I should have, but yeah,
well, it's interesting.
I think that train is going to continue. Go ahead, Jim.
Oh yeah, right. And I think it's interesting that if you paid attention back in March, with the White House cybersecurity strategy that came out, one of the things that came out of that was, and I don't know if you've talked about it on the show or not, but it's so pertinent to what we're talking about, is the vendor responsibility for security and zero trust type security in their space. So if you have any customer data, the responsibility and more importantly, I think accountability you're going to have, and the regulations that are going to come down.
Yes, you're seeing them more and more.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting an article, or an interesting principle, or an interesting thing that came out of that cybersecurity strategy.
I'd agree.
Just to drive, third-party risk and zero trust.
Yeah, and you mentioned the regulators, and you see that. I mean, you had the interagency guidance so you had three agencies that probably don't know each other's phone numbers. The OCC, FDIC, and FRB all agree and release an interagency guidance. That's unique in of itself, right?
That's right.
Yeah, the SEC recently come out with regulatory guidance on third-party relationships, which again, seriously, I mean, it's great, but I'm surprised at the number of agencies, and I shouldn't be, that are now getting engaged on this space, and it's because they see for what it is, what a lot of us have seen it for what it is, which is it's ripe for maturity.
Okay.
The numbers pre-COVID and post-COVID are slightly better, but not much different. I think for pre-COVID it was around 65% of companies in a blind or an anonymous survey would self-report that they had no or ad hoc process around third-party risk management. The number's slightly better now at around 60%. That's still over half the companies that are
Right.
not doing anything about third-party risk management. That is a scary thought.
Very, very scary.
But it's also an opportunity for folks like us to talk to them about how to do it and how to mature. Maybe, and it's an opportunity for book sales.
So let me
So
ask you a question, Greg, because I
yeah,
there is
please.
one thing that's really driving my thoughts these days. I mean, this 800-207-A, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's all well and good, and I'm going to I want to understand from a third party risk perspective. Um,
Right.
how are you bringing in things like artificial intelligence to drive how
Ah,
you do business? Right, because that's an
yeah,
interesting
yeah,
thing to me. I'm doing a whole lot of stuff around it on zero trust
yeah,
and identity
yep,
management. I'm curious from the TPRM side.
yeah, yeah. Um, there's a couple plays in this space for AI that I've seen. One is around sort of getting humans out of just the rote work of looking at questionnaires and figuring out which one's the matchy match, right? And actually, I've seen some demos that are really promising, like in the 80 to 90% range, where they'll take a lot of the conflict between vendor and organization or company is we want to know from the vendor how they do their security, and they have and we have our own input way, and they're going to tell us, but it doesn't always match, and so we kind of spend time trying to figure out how to get the gears in together, right? And that takes human time, and we don't have infinite humans, and budgets are getting really tight. So the way to solve for this is to use the AI to take their data, your due diligence questionnaire, and have it auto magically fill based upon the question that the AI figures. Oh, it's asking for this. I think that's this answer over here. And the demos I've seen with the live data again are very good. I'm not going to mention the companies I've tested. Obviously, that's not appropriate. But so far, I've seen great feedback from these guys. The other that can get you into a better space where you're focused in on the real risks, the real mismatches, right? So the human brain is better used on those things to make intelligence decisions about the risk. And you can't use AI to evaluate your risk appetite. That's still the regulators clearly state that's you to do. That's a human.
Absolutely.
The other space where I think the AI can do is start to look at some of the vulnerabilities that we see and helping us make more predictive decisions about where this might be going. Meaning, a lot of our work in this space, and it's typical in any cyberspace, is we're very reactive, right? We're waiting for somebody to call us to say the poop has hit the fan, right?
That's right.
I'd like to turn the fan off before the poop hits it. So to use the analogy, right? So having AI get in front of some of your cyber threat intel feeds, the vendor risk rating tool software data that you're getting, your own due diligence data in a data lake or data pond, and having it look at making those decisions, telling you, hey, third party risk leaders, we see these vendors trending red, meaning they have risks open, and they have alerts and threats that are coming that pretend for an intervention. Let's call it an intervention.
Yep.
Those are great ways. That's a much better conversation to have than the poop has already hit the fan.
Yes.
We see you about ready to throw the poop, and we want to prevent you from doing it. Okay, so again, to keep the analogy going, sorry for those at home, but again, the idea there is that you don't end up with a mess, and you're using AI in productive ways. I think the challenge for most organizations is AI risk itself. It's now become the issue. AI and model risk is now something that we're discussing, and how do you deal for it? How do you test for it? And that's a problem that we're dealing with. So, one opportunity presents a new challenge, I guess is the way to put it. What are your thoughts on it, Jerry?
Oh, again, I'm not an expert in TPRM, right? Third party risk, so I can't speak to it from that side, from a zero trust side, and from
Right.
an identity side. There are certainly plays, right? But I could talk about that for the next hour. But
Yeah.
what I will tell you is I think that AI is going to be a fantastic tool for two reasons, right? One,
Hmm.
understand it's a tool to exactly what you said. It's to help answer, to give those decisions and give those answers, but it still takes some intelligence. It takes some sort of review and analysis to determine, is that true? Is that real? Right. So there's still
Right.
that human intervention. I think it can speed up the signal processing in a zero trust world.
Yep.
Because we have SIMs and SOARs that do all these things that correlate data and correlate these signals. I think it can
That's right.
help and expedite those types of things to get into that more proactive, or as opposed to reactive mode that you described.
Yeah. Yeah.
In an identity world, my favorite. Well, before I talk about that, my favorite question recently
Hmm.
was, how do you handle an AI engine as an identity guy? I'm like, it's just another persona. Let's just call it like it is. It's just another
That's
persona
right.
that you're
Yeah.
driving access to. So it's really, really
That's true.
interesting.
Very good.
Um, and then I think there's certain things we do in identity that we can bring AI in to be a real good tool to support the things we do and to speed up the things we do. I mean,
Right.
listen, I've been doing identity projects for years and years and years, and we used to love, hey, we're going to do, we're going to take the next 6 months and we're going to do this part of the project, and it's going to take us 3 months to do it. I think those days are not there anymore. I think it's like I can take that 3 months that we might have done some stuff, feed some of that data into an AI, and come out with something much faster.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah, I
and
agree.
just,
Yeah.
but it just makes us better at our job. Makes us do
It's a tool.
better things. It's a tool, and if we look at it as
Yeah.
anything else, then uh, you know, I love the movie Terminator, but it's not Skynet.
No, it's not. No, no. Yeah, yeah, and like I said, if you think it's doing anything else, I like my grandpa's old statement. Grandpa's was, "Son, you're looking at the wrong end of the mule."
I love
You
that.
know,
I love
yeah,
that.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. It is. It's true. Well, we're almost at time. Any parting thoughts for the audience on zero trust, third party risk, just in general?
I would say if you haven't, go out and pre-order Greg's book. It's a great book. He I think Greg, you spent a lot of
Thank you.
time doing the research. I think you reached out to myself and others to make sure you did it right, and I think you did. So absolutely, Pete, do that, and I'll plug my book for again for a moment. Zero Trust
Please, I
Security
think
and
it's great.
Enterprise Guide. It's I still get rave reviews coming back from it. So please, by all means,
Yeah, too.
go take a look and yeah,
And I recommend it because so as you've said, as both of us have said a couple times on this, we're not an expert this or expert that, right? The cyber field is expansive, and
that's right.
their expertise along many different domains. And a lot of us struggle with imposter syndrome of our own existing expertise. Um, so I really appreciate your book because it made it approachable for me, and for areas I wasn't necessarily an expert on. Right, I didn't struggle with the terminology or the explanations you were giving. So I recommend it for folks who are looking to learn about zero trust. That's a great way that's your gateway drug, as it were, to zero trust. That your book is a great way to get kind of hooked on it as an addict, right? And it really sells you on, I think, the finer points of it. And then if you want to figure out how to marry the two, third party and zero trust, then the second book would be mine. The idea there is a practical guide, right? Both books, I believe, provide the users with real world experience about how to implement it, and that was important for, I think, both of us, right? We didn't want to talk in abstract necessarily. We wanted to provide users with ways to implement it in real world and not just like an Encyclopedia Britannica that is sort of abstract.
And it sits on a
Jerry,
shelf and it gets no value.
that's right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm sure you had the same experience too, where people have had you sign your book, and it's all kind of tattered and
Yes,
dog eared, and I love that. I've had people apologize, like, I'm sorry. It's like, no, that's exactly. I would be upset if I was cracking the spine for the first time to sign it for you. I'm
that's right.
happy that you've used it, and please, that's great. So I'm sure you feel the same way, Jerry. It's great when we see
One
that.
hundred percent.
That's it's reassuring because you don't know when you write a book how it's going to be perceived. So
That's
that's
right.
great. Jerry, it's been a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to the feedback we get from this session. And I'm also hoping we cross paths here in another a conference or two sometime in the near future, so we can shake hands again.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, I'll touch base with you hopefully soon. And again, thanks for being a guest.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks for having me. It's been an honor.
Cheers. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.